If your neighbor's army lands in your yard, you're not hosting a friendly visit, you're under occupation. If a superpower seizes a sitting president suddenly, you're staring at a diplomatic earthquake with global fallout. If allies applaud and cheer publicly, while the UN fumes and condemns the act, expect a dramatic regional realignment of power and influence. The raid pulled Maduro from a military base in a nighttime operation. He is now facing U.S. narco-terror charges in Manhattan. He pleaded not guilty at his Manhattan arraignment. He calls himself a prisoner of war, not a criminal. Washington says it will run Venezuela temporarily, taking control briefly, provoking fury from the UN and diplomats worldwide, and fury from Russia's government and media too, and fury from China, warning of precedent as well, and fury from regional leaders across Latin America. Legal experts warn of a major breach of sovereignty. Some governments cheer the removal openly. Others warn such actions could unleash chaos and instability. Bottom line, this could redraw alliances across the hemisphere and spark new sanctions from multiple states quickly, reshape oil politics across the Americas, hitting markets, and reshape security politics across the Americas for years.
So the entire news cycle has, it's just been completely dominated by what happened in early January 2026.
Oh, absolutely. The capture of Nicolas Maduro and Cilia Flores in Caracas.
Right. Operation Absolute Resolve.
Yeah.
That's what the U.S. called it. They're framing it as a law enforcement action against a, quote, fugitive from justice.
Mm-hmm.
But for us, the real question is, how did Venezuela even get to this point?
Exactly. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to trace the political science of it, the evolution of the Venezuelan system from what was a flawed democracy into, well, what most analysts ended up calling a mature dictatorship.
And what's so interesting is that it wasn't a standard overt authoritarianism. You've called it legalistic authoritarianism.
Yeah. Yes. And that's the key. It means the regime worked very hard to keep up a constitutional facade. They used the law itself, and especially the courts they controlled, to methodically, piece by piece, dismantle all the checks and balances.
Which makes it so much more complicated, right?
Yeah.
It gives them this veneer of legitimacy.
It does. Let's really zero in on that timeline. The power grab, it really, really accelerates after the opposition wins that huge parliamentary landslide back in 2015.
And the outgoing government, they didn't waste a single day.
Not one. They immediately packed the Supreme Tribunal of Justice, the TSJ, with absolute loyalists. And that sets the stage for the, what many call the self-coup.
Which was in March 2017.
Correct. The TSJ issues two rulings, decisions 155 and 156. And those decisions just officially stripped the National Assembly, the only independent branch left of all its legislative powers. It was neutralized.
So when that move sparked massive protests.
Yeah.
How did the regime completely sidestep the parliament they'd just neutered?
Well, they just created a new body, the National Constituent Assembly, or ANC.
But wasn't that completely illegitimate?
Fundamentally, because they convened it without the popular referendum that's required by their own constitution. It was essentially a parallel state, just built to rubber stamp anything the regime wanted.
Okay, so if the judicial takeover wasn't clear enough, the 2024 presidential election seems like the final nail in the coffin for any democratic pretense.
It really was. The whole thing shifted to what you could call managed events. The National Electoral Council comes out and declares Maduro the winner with 51.2%.
A very narrow margin.
Very. But the opposition's own tallies, which were verified at over 80% of the voting booths, they showed Edmundo González Urrutia winning with something like 67%.
A landslide.
A decisive win. And the regime's refusal to release the basic, disaggregated booth-level data to prove their count, that was the final signal. They weren't even pretending anymore.
And when fraud wasn't enough, that's when the coercion, the real infrastructure repression, kicked in.
It really ramped up. After the election, they launched Operation Tun-Tun, Operation Knock Knock, a systematic campaign of just mass arbitrary arrests.
And it wasn't just the state security force.
No, and this is crucial. They relied heavily on the colectivos, these armed civilian groups loyal to the regime, to enforce control through violence and intimidation.
There's also a chilling detail in the source material about their use of technology, an app called VenApp.
Yes, a government-sponsored app that actually encouraged citizens to inform on their neighbors, to report dissent. And that information was then used to, facilitate these raids and arrests.
Wow, so that internal repression, the stolen election, the collectivos, That basically gave external actors the opening they needed.
It did. It allowed them to frame the regime not just as undemocratic, but as a criminal enterprise.
Which brings us right back to January 2026. You had over 50 countries that already saw Maduro as illegitimate, with Russia and China offering support. But the U.S. legal case for Operation Absolute Resolve, it wasn't about democracy at all.
No, it was based on criminal law, specifically those long-standing indictments out of the Southern District of New York.
And the core allegations there were shocking.
They identified Maduro as the head of the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, a state-sponsored narco-terrorist group, essentially. The charges were for managing the trafficking of several hundred tons of cocaine a year.
So when you put it all together, the takeover of the courts, the suppression of the vote, the institutionalized violence, the conclusion is pretty clear.
It is. This was a mature dictatorship, one based on total institutional capture and ultimately on criminal governance.
And his capture now leaves us with this huge, unresolved question in international law.
The biggest question, really. Does an indictment for transnational organized crime justify a foreign power conducting a military-style law enforcement operation against a sitting head of state? Or, does that action completely undermine the principle of national sovereignty? That's the precedent you now have to think about as this all unfolds.